In this video I'm going to have a look at the first part of what I worked on. So it basically started on this organizational management area, so teams and users, and this was my initial ideas on how I'd structure that here. And what this slide shows is sort of the focus on teams and users. I've actually completed most of this, so I ran through, I sketched out some rules that I wanted to have for teams and users, what different users with different roles could do, some of the capabilities about getting listings of users for teams, those sort of things. So something I found as I started on this is initially on users, you see up here, I had the idea that I'd just have a list of teams that the user is associated with, and in that have an object that defines both the team and the role of the user on the team. Unfortunately, there wasn't a good way that I could do a query across all users and just find users with certain teams or role information. So the way I ended up doing it was actually created 3 arrays on the user's object, and the arrays had the list of teams for each of the different types of roles. So whether you're a manager of a team, a member of a team, or a reviewer of a team, had the list of teams that applied to. And this worked out well. I could do one query, or actually did 3 queries over users, combine them, and could get a view of what members were on teams, as well as quickly from the user record being able to see what rights the user had on a particular team. And these are sort of the decisions you have to make with a NoSQL database where you can't do a lot of relationships and things like that. The other thing I added was can create teams as another boolean on user record, so I could implement some of these things down here where some people, so administrator, can always create teams, but some users could also create teams, and that impacted the user interface that I created. So I took this information and I went through the following set of activities. So I updated the user and team models in my Angular data application, created a team service. I also modified the user service to add some more capabilities into that. I created some components. This was my initial idea. I'll have a look at what I actually did. I created Firestore.Rules for teams so that someone who hasn't got rights to can't change things they shouldn't be changed to at the database level as well. Created the routes, route guards, and menu items. I didn't actually need to create the route guards in the end. The way the roles worked for the functionality and the components is I didn't need to control that with route guards. I had enough security with what someone could do in a particular page, and then with the Firestore.Rules what they could do at the database level. And I still need to create the Cypress tests. So this is kind of the structure of what I created, and I'll just go through the user interface that I created in a little while. But I call out which components I created. So I ended up creating 6 components to manage this area. So a teams component, which just simply shows a list of teams or the teams that a certain user has access to. Then from the teams component, you can click on one of the teams, and then you go into this component here, the team component, which has the basic team information. You can also update the team information on here. It also has this component embedded inside the component called team user list, which is a list of members of that team. There's certain rights given to different users depending on what their role is for that team, on whether they can create team members or add a team member to a certain team, whether they can delete a team member, and the rules on the previous page talk about what the would turn this functionality on and off for a user. And then depending on whether they choose add team member or remove team member, it also brings up another component as a dialog. So I'm using material dialogues for this, where they can select the role and also search for users. And I implemented a little bit of a type ahead function in here as well. So I created another component called user finder, where as you type in the user's name, it starts displaying the users who match underneath. So between these two components, they can choose a role and a user and then add them to a certain team. And the other component I created as well is a dialog, is implemented as a dialog, as this teams user remove. So it's really a confirmation dialog for selecting a team member on a team and then deciding whether to remove them or just cancel out of the removal process. Okay, let's have a look at the user interface after building the Angular application. So just for teams and users, so I've signed on as 3 different users. So this first tab, I'm signed on as myself as a administrator. Second tab, I'm signed on as tester1, who is not an administrator, and third tab is tester2. So looking at tester as the administrator. So when I go in and look at the teams list, I see all the teams, and I also can create a new team. If I look at one of the teams, I can see all the members of that team, as well as being able to add a new team member. So I can see here, I can say I want someone as a new manager, and type ahead to refine the list of users, select one, and then I can add it. I won't do that. And I can also delete a team member. So if I click on that, it confirms whether I can want to delete that person or not. I'll say no. So administrators can do everything. So the next tab, I'm signed in as tester1, and just have a look at tester1's rights. So I'm going to go into the user list, look at tester1. So tester1 is not an administrator but can create teams. So if we look at tester1's view of teams, they can see teams and they can create a new team because they have that flag on their user record to say they can create teams. If I look at the list at the Angular team, they are just a reviewer for the Angular team. So tester1 is a reviewer for the Angular team, so they don't have the ability to add another member or remove the members that are there. If I go back and look at Java developers, you see here that tester1 is a manager, so they do have the rights to add a new member or delete a member from the team. So that's kind of the next level of rights there. And then this would be more typical of just a person who's just a member of a team. So when I go in, they just see the teams that they're members of. So just Angular in this case was the only team that tester2 was a member of. If I click on Angular, they can see other team members, but they can't add or remove those team members because they're not a manager, they're just a reviewer. So rest of this video, I'll just highlight some parts in the code, and then a follow-on video I'm going to look at a query I set up in User.Service to get all the users who were members of a team by passing it the team name. And I'm putting it in a separate video just because it's kind of what I did is useful in other places as well, where I want to do the equivalent of like a SQL or union across a data set where I want to pick up different groups of documents or records based on multiple OR conditions over that one data set, which natively you can't do in Firestore with the queries, but by using observables and combining them into one observable you can do. So it's kind of a useful technique that probably used in a lot of places. So they'll be in a separate video after this. Okay, let's have a look where I used a filter on an observable. Okay, so in the teams component you get different views of the teams that a user can see. So as tester2, who only is a member of one team, they can only see that one team. As tester1, who is a manager and a reviewer for each of these teams, they see Angular and Java developers. And then as an administrator, you see all teams. So this was done in the teams component. So down here I get an observable with all the teams in it. Then I can pipe that and map that, and then just map the teams array that gets returned. If the person's an administrator, then I can just return that teams array, so all the teams get seen when it's displayed on in the HTML template. Otherwise, if they're not an administrator, then it does a teams filter. So remember, teams is an array of teams, so I filter that array based on this condition. So when team, depending on whether they're a member of the team, a manager of the team, so remember that's arrays on the user's record, or whether they are a reviewer of teams. So if any of those is true, then it is included in the filtered list of teams. So if you've got any role on a team, then that team gets returned as part of this filter. Okay, have a look at the Firestore.Rules. So I'm in the Firestore.Rules file, and this gets deployed up to the Firebase project Firestore.Rules. So I added a couple of functions here for reuse. So one is a function to check if someone's a team manager. So the code's here, so it looks into the manager of teams array, and if the size is not 0, then it means that user is a team manager somewhere. Another function I've got here is to check on updates to the user record. So this condition will check that the person's only updating the teams array on the user records, because we don't want users to be able to update other information on other people's user records. So having this rule function in place allows me to put this rule in place down here. So on the user collection, it allows anyone to read it if they're admin or authenticated, allows anyone to create a user record if they're authenticated. So that needs to happen when they first sign into the system. It creates the user document for the person. And the important one here is allow update. Before, in the template, I only allowed people to who were administrators to update other people's user records or user documents. I've made a change here, so as well as giving everyone visibility to other people's user records if they're authenticated, it allows other people, so this is a case where someone's a manager of a team and needs to update the roles on other users to say they are members of that team. So it has this condition here: if the current user is team manager, which we just looked at the function, and it is a user teams update, so it's only updating fields on the user record related to the team role arrays, then it's going to allow them to do the update there. Finally, for this video, just look at some of the functions I added into the User.Service. Also in the next video, like I said, I'm going to cover this find by team ID as a separate video. Okay, so find by partial name. So in the user finder dialog, I can type ahead to filter users by the start of their username, and it's this routine that does it. So basically it's doing a where it's looking for display name values which are between the display name that was passed to this function, and that display name is less than the display name plus the tilde character, which is one of the highest ASCII values. So it basically gives you the range of display names between that starting point. So say if I put a T in there, between T and T tilde, and returns all the matching users. A couple of other routines to look at that I put in here was the remove user from team. So that gets called from the remove user dialog, and it just goes in and adjusts the the user list of teams for the user that's been removed to remove that team from whichever role array it needs to remove it from, and it gets that role array by looking at this team roles array defined globally. And add user to team, same sort of thing. It gets past the user ID that's been added, the team ID that they've been added to in their role. It goes through, again, finds the array that it needs to work on based on the role. So first, if that array for that role isn't defined, then it can just do a set to add the property to the user record. If a list of roles has already been defined for that particular user, then it'll go through, just make sure that team has not been already put on that role, otherwise it returns with an error, or else it'll adjust the array by pushing the new team ID onto that particular role array, and then updating the field using the current DB field update routine.